Back from the break, everyone. And next up, we're going to take a look at the history and evolution of digital cash. I'd like to welcome our moderator, Garrick Hileman from CoinDesk, Nathaniel Popper from the New York Times, and Christopher Allen to the stage, please.
Great. All right. Thank you very much for prying yourselves away from the break to come listen to a little bit of history. Sometimes a difficult topic, especially late in a conference, to get people to focus on. But we're going to try to keep this really interesting and fresh. We only have 20 minutes. We've got a wonderful panel here. So Nathaniel Popper, as I'm sure many of you know, is a reporter for the New York Times and has written an excellent book on the early history of Bitcoin and some of the prehistory, if you will. Called Digital Gold. I've read it. If you're a fan of Andrew Ross Sorkin's Too Big to Fail and that style of writing, you'll pick this up and you'll be finished with it in a day or two like I was. To my right is Christopher Allen, who's an internet security pioneer. I've got his card here because I'm going to get a card like this. It's two-sided and it's got everything on it. So anything you want to know about Christopher Allen, pretty much business-wise at least, is right here. He is the co-author of the TLS security protocol. He actually created a company called Consensus back in the late 1980s. So this is a man who is very much ahead of his time. He's currently at the Blockchain University, and he does consulting work for a variety of companies in the space. So let's start things off with Christopher here. So the first question we wanted to talk about was, while alternative currencies, non-state currencies, non-national currencies, are nothing new. A paper I wrote kind of looked at the 500-year history of alternative currencies and their successes and failures. Cryptocurrency is relatively new. Where was some of the original inspiration for cryptocurrencies? When does cryptocurrencies really kind of arrive on the historical landscape?
I'll say oddly, the cypherpunk generation learned it from science fiction of the 60s and the 70s. I mean, I can distinctly remember as a young teenager reading Robert Heinlein, and there are actual lectures about economics and banks and whatever in his book Time Enough for Love. I can remember the space traders in Andre Norton's books about swiping a credit stick, I think is what she called it. And then I can remember having conversations in the early 80s about the economics of the Star Trek universe. This abundant society where you could make anything you wanted, and how did you pay for things, and who owned who was the cook that made that or made the master version of that. Turns out a lot of the cypherpunks of the 80s were at those same science fiction conventions having these same conversations about what does it mean to have a culture of abundance, to have this vision that Heinlein or Roddenberry had. So that kind of got us all on a certain footing as far as what we wanted to have, was we wanted that future.
Great. Now, I asked you if you consider yourself a cypherpunk. You said no, you do not subscribe to that label. But Nathaniel, in your book, you write about Hal Finney, the cypherpunks. Who are these people? I'm not sure everyone here has heard of the cypherpunks or knows much about them.
Sure.
What was their role in creating cryptocurrency and Bitcoin?
Right. Well, cypherpunks was, I think, early online community. A couple of luminary founders, Mays and Hughes, who wrote these manifestos. And a lot of what they were interested in was thinking about how what happens to privacy as technology expands. And so a lot of this was, these futurists who loved technology, but I think also saw how technology compromised this thing that they cared about deeply, which was privacy. And what's interesting to see in the cypherpunk dialogues in the 90s, a lot of which happened online, although there were in-person meetings, was how quickly the conversation came to the question of money. And if we care about privacy, and if we care about a future with privacy, we have to think about what money's going to look like in the future. And so you got these conversations started where people were imagining what the money of the future would look like. And a lot of it referred back to science fiction. But then people started coding these things up and imagining what it would look like. And the amazing thing, I think, is how quickly, even in the 90s, the conversation got right to the nub of the issue that we're still talking about today, which is having centralized money, and how do you get away from a central gatekeeper with money, and how do you move to some sort of decentralized money? Mm-hmm. And so that conversation was there right from the 1990s and very spirited terms. And obviously, it's kind of that's the seed from, I think, mm-hmm. which a lot of the rest of this grew.
And I would say even prior to the 90s, there's this wonderful book called The Ecology of Computation that was published in 1988. There's this wonderful paper by Phil Salen, who did American Information Exchange, which by all rights should have been the PayPal or of today. They chose a moment in time that was before the internet, so they were doing non-TCP protocols, and because of that, they failed. So there was a lot of stuff that was stirring at that same time, and a lot of different desires to try to make the world a better place.
Mm-hmm. It's always dangerous to start mentioning names and who deserves credit for some of the early stuff. I'll just mention one because it's really interesting. There's a Wired article from 20 years ago featuring David Chaum and Digicash. If you, in the beginning of that article, substituted Digicash with Bitcoin, it would read very much like the vision, to the T around Bitcoin today. So there's certainly a lot of press coverage, I think, of some of the earlier efforts. If you're interested in kind of going back online, just reading about some of the precursors to Bitcoin. So let's kind of start to move forward a little bit. So people were working on this stuff in the 90s. We can mention some more names if we want to, but what happened? There was a bit of a lull, a break. Tell me about that and why then Bitcoin came into existence a few years after that.
Well, certainly within the cypherpunk community, there were a few people who were really excited about this in the 90s, and a lot of them wanted to use Digicash and David Chaum's creation, where you worked, I think, for a time, and that suffered, among other things, from this issue of having this central authority. David Chaum was very interested in privacy, but you still had this problem that the transactions had to go in some way through David Chaum's company, and so that fell apart. And so you had a bunch of other experiments, BitGold, B-Money, a guy, Wei Dai, who I think you mentioned, and Nick Szabo, who continued to be an interesting character in this, were experimenting with this. And Adam Back created Hashcash. And what's fascinating is to see the way that all of those projects failed. And people did sort of think, you know what, this is too hard, too much. We're not going to get anywhere with this. And the way that it took almost a decade of just kind of silent fermentation for those things to bubble up again. And it was really a lot of those projects from the 1990s that ended up being cobbled together to make Bitcoin. But as you said, you had this sort of 10 years before the financial crisis happened where people, to some degree, kind of gave up on the project, even though people like Hal Finney and Nick Szabo kept kind of working at it in their own way and kept maintain their interest. To see the waves of technological innovation and the way that you have these ebbs and flows is pretty fascinating.
And definitely there were a lot of factors. So one of the things that happened in the late 90s is what I call the tragedy of the free. The internet basically exploded. We had lots of investment into various startups for what became the first dot bomb. So there was so much money flowing that they could offer things for free. They could offer services for free. And a lot of the ideas that were out there were around microcurrencies, around being able to give very small amounts of money for things. I mean, I remember talking with Ted Nelson, if you know that name, from Xanadu, and his big deal was, oh, well, when somebody uses or makes a derived work based on your work, you ought to get a little bit of the money from that, and a little bit of money flows, and it'll all add up, and the world will be a better place because everybody will be rewarded. Well, everything became free, and nobody wanted to pay even a small amount of money for things. All the pieces for what is Bitcoin today existed in 2000. All the individual technologies were there. They just weren't packaged up very well, and they were beginning to be, and then we had the stock market crash of 2001, which basically killed everything. I was the CTO of Certicom, and we had a project to do effectively what was Bitcoin, and we had Nick Szabo on the staff, but they cut the budget because of all the circumstances of 2001. So then we had this, 6-year period of trying to recover from the dot-bomb, and people weren't trusting, internet companies. A lot of companies weren't able to raise money. And then we have another crash, this time not because of the dot-com industry. But now this is where the key thing that happened with Bitcoin. It wasn't just the technology, it was also the timing. And that's, I think, what your story tells so well about how sort of this perfect timing, perfect storm of political and economic circumstances.
Yeah, and the Bitcoin white paper literally being published, I think, 4 or 5 weeks after Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. And obviously, one of the most delicious, maybe sad ironies of Bitcoin, we'll see how it plays out from here, is that this was designed pretty firmly at the beginning as a way to circumvent centralized authorities, most of all central banks and Wall Street. And I don't know if our sponsor names are up there, but it's amazing to see how we've reached a point where those are two of the things that, the number of sort of central bankers and Wall Street folks walking around here, how far that history has taken us from that original vision. And it's not necessarily inconsistent, but to look back at 2008 and look at the sense that we need an alternative to this existing system, and the boldness of that vision, and the real belief that this wasn't just software. This was much more than software, and I think that's something, this understanding this history and seeing how this was 2 decades of people kind of pouring their heart and soul into this. And I think a lot of times people today have this sense that Satoshi Nakamoto kind of created this idea, kind of pulled it together and threw it out there, a bolt out of the blue. But you look down into that paper and you look down into that code and you see 20 or 30 years of work and different people that went into this. And, whoever Satoshi Nakamoto was, there's a lot of people authored the parts that are in that code, and obviously now in these notions of the blockchain and smart contract that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I'm interested in kind of the story here around the history of cryptocurrencies is this incredibly innovative technology that came out of this process, this collaboration. The term that I like that dates back a long time ago is the Invisible College. It was an informal kind of network outside of academia that people used to collaborate many centuries ago. It seems kind of like a quasi-invisible college. So one of the things I know about the beginnings of Bitcoin is that when Satoshi released the paper, I think there was a little skepticism that was, it was greeted with some skepticism, like, show me the code, was basically, I think, what a lot of people said. Tell me about 10 years before that, when a lot of work was going on. Was there this same kind of like show me the code attitude, or were people more open to just laying out concepts? And did the failures of the late 90s, if you will, the frustrations, did that lead to the kind of show me the code reaction that Satoshi initially got?
A little bit, although I say the early days of all of this were very distorted by the patent situation. So it wasn't just showing me the code, it was showing me that you did it without violating somebody's patent. By the time 2008 rolled around, a lot of the patents had expired or were getting close to expiring. I mean, I distinctly remember the whole hash tree thing. I wanted to do a lot of stuff with it, but the company who had that patent until like the mid-2000s was really bad about pursuing it. Anybody who tried to do anything with a hash tree. So, by 2008, with the patents expiring, it was a lot more of show me the code, and also a lot of skepticism because, you know, there were a variety of things. Even the standard that I worked on, you know, SSL TLS, version 1 was presented at the crypto conference, and it was cracked. It was broken in an hour. So, you know, just you know, 1.0s of anything are nowhere near good enough.
Great. So the process by which cryptocurrencies came into existence, I think, is absolutely fascinating. People collaborating, sharing ideas with people they've never met. Some people extremely private. Full disclosure, I'm working with Andrew Miller, who's a cryptographer at the University of Maryland, and Nick Szabo on kind of a history of cryptocurrencies. Nick told me he's never met Wei Dai. So far as we know, no one's ever met Wei Dai. He's literally just an email address out there. Yet people are sharing ideas with Wei. He's collaborating, very responsive on email. Wei is. I can vouch for that. How does something so innovative? How is it born out of such little interpersonal interaction? There's no water cooler moments, or maybe there are, but they're happening outside of the cypherpunks mailing list. You know, it's just fascinating to me this incredibly innovative thing happened through this kind of, I'd say almost, you know, non-Silicon Valley process, or was it really a Silicon Valley process? I mean,
I don't know. I mean, there's a number of different things here. There is a lot of social capital in the open source movement. So I remember with David Chaum, before he was able to get Mark Twain Bank to kind of start up Digicash, which was, we were saying earlier, was one of the real predecessors here, you know, had this wonderful blinded anonymous technology. So we created like a reputation currency. I could give you some of these, you know, what would now be called woofie, some social capital to different people. So I think there was a strong recognition around, you know, gift economy, around the fact that, you know, you can multiply value by sharing it in different kinds of ways. And that the people who did so, especially the people who did so with something, you know, that was an identity, it didn't have to be a real identity, it could be a pseudonymous identity, that this could be of value.
And I mean, I think it is worth recognizing that to some degree, and I hope I'm not insulting anybody, this is a money by nerds for nerds. It's for people who aren't necessarily comfortable with social interaction. A lot of the people who were involved in the creation of this are people who already lived so much of their lives sort of through virtual conversations with people. And because they lived there, they imagine there should be a money for that space that works like cash does in the physical world. And so you had a lot of, I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right that there were a lot of people who were working on this who never met each other. And I mean, to me, one of the most amazing stories of Bitcoin is that in the first year, after Hal Finney sort of gave up and Satoshi was still going, this young Finnish college student named Marty Malmi, who, you know, kind of had to teach himself C++ on the fly. Really, the reason he had time to work on Bitcoin was because he didn't get a summer internship in Finland. And this was a classic kid who, you know, kind of had his headphones on, was playing video games, and he found Bitcoin. And he kind of was Satoshi's Bitcoin community for the next 6 months. He was the one who was maintaining the website and updating it. He was the one who got credit when versions, you know, 0.15 came out. He was the one who was doing all the updates. And he was a guy who, he certainly never met Satoshi. Part of the allure was, we're leaving the corporeal world. You know, it really was this futurist visionary thing. We have a money that we can send anywhere, and I have my identity that is as simple as this private key. And that was incredibly crucial in keeping this thing alive for 2 years when it wasn't worth anything. And I mean, as much as everybody thinks about how hard it might be for Bitcoin to survive to the next, through the next year to the next stage, I mean, the fact that it made it through those first 2 years, why did anybody keep using it? It was worth nothing. You couldn't do anything with them. And yet people cared enough about this to keep playing with it and keep experimenting with it and keep staying up all night. And I mean, there's something really, deep there. That's why I was so drawn to this story. I mean, obviously, it has been commercialized, and it's continuing to be more commercialized. But the roots of this thing are 25 years of nobody making any money on anything.
And timing is everything. I mean, once again, I think Bitcoin could have easily died. The skepticism about it, the concerns about it. And then we had the Occupy movement. And all of a sudden, once again, it kind of hit with a certain zeitgeist where, oh my gosh, this addresses some of the problems that now have reached a larger part of the culture.
Mm-hmm. Great. We're starting to get a little low on time here, but a few more questions. So Newton, famous for saying, if I see farther, it's because I stand on the shoulders of giants. You mentioned, Malma, right, from
Marty Malmi, yeah.
Yes. Who are some of the other, people that were really instrumental, some of the unsung heroes, if you will, to Bitcoin's existence, both before it came into existence and even during the early years? Of course, Hal Finney is someone you write about. I mean, tell us some more of their stories.
I'm just going to say one in a different direction, and that's Ross Ulbricht. I think that Silk Road is often seen as a stain upon Bitcoin. I've heard it referred to as the original sin. Again, it was 2 years when Silk Road went online. You could basically buy nothing for a Bitcoin. Nobody had really, I mean, it was worth 50 cents the day that Silk Road went online. It was worth $1 a day later. Its sharpest price increase in those, basically those first 2 years. Silk Road proved that Bitcoin worked. It proved that you could actually send real value across the world. And people were willing to try that experiment because they had an incentive to, because getting heroin that way was that much better than the alternative. And to me, you have to, that's a pretty good standard. How much better do you have to be than the alternative to get somebody to use this? You don't just have to be a little bit better, you have to be a lot better. And Silk Road provided a much better experience in the market that it served. So there are a number of ways in which I think Silk Road was crucial to making Bitcoin work. It also, because of all the publicity it got, it drew in so many developers who I spoke with who didn't necessarily want to buy drugs, but realized, okay, wait a minute, if this works to send a payment to Amsterdam for $200, within 10 minutes, this could be really interesting. I mean, a bunch of guys I talked to who worked at Google who first found out about it through the Silk Road and then ended up becoming, key figures. The creator of Litecoin, Charlie Lee, is somebody who, he's not a heroin user himself, as far as I know, but that woke him up to the potential of this. And so I know that wasn't the kind of cypherpunk origins of it, but that's kind of a story that I think often gets misunderstood or forgotten in the tale of Bitcoin's rise.
I'll close with two names a lot further back. Eric Drexler, he coined the term nanotechnology, and he created an organization called the Foresight Institute in the late 80s to basically go, hey, this could be a real problem. Let's have some foresight and planning. And he drew all these marvelous people in, many of which who were the founders of the cypherpunk movement. And Phil Salen, who founded American Information Exchange, who also brought a lot of the early leaders of cryptography and Oracle computing and marketplaces. So look up both those names.
Great. We might have time for two quick questions if we can get to them. So early years of Bitcoin are often compared to the early years of the internet. A lot of porn, et cetera, on the internet, became a very useful utility that wasn't just about, distasteful activities or illicit activities. Do you like that metaphor? Do you think that holds? Is that a good way of thinking about kind of the Silk Road's role in promoting Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very, I always think it's a very optimistic analogy for Bitcoin to compare yourself to the internet. But I think, it certainly is has a lot of the same look to it. And I think the other really important thing, to look back to it about the internet experience, but also about Bitcoin's early experiences, that you just never know what's going to matter in the end. You never know which parts of it are going to somebody's going to find a way to fit them together. And that going back to the early Bitcoin history, you had, Adam Back created Hashcash in 1997, and it was this effort to kind of stop spam in people's email inboxes. And it kind of seemed like it failed. It didn't work. And 10 years later, Satoshi kind of took Hashcash and made it one of the key Hashcash and made it one of the key, working parts of Bitcoin. And I think, that's a really instructive loop that is going to happen again and again. And I think, there's obviously so much talk about what's going to work from this, what's going to work from now. This is a very in-between moment where it's not clear what is going to work. And I think oftentimes it's the things you least expect that end up being the ones that matter in ways that people didn't anticipate.
Great. Please join me in thanking our excellent panel.